I'm Tori Mishu, the Executive Director of the Hillsborough Arts Council, and I welcome you all to the Hillsborough Arts Council's Writers Series program. I want to thank all of today's guests for joining in this conversation to remember Randall Kenan. Let me now introduce Stephen Petro, who will be moderating today's program. Stephen has lived in Hillsborough for 7 years now, and he's a columnist for the Washington Post and one of our local authors. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Tori, and thanks to the Hillsborough Arts Council for bringing us together. It's a sad honor to be here today to remember Randall Kenan, who was our friend, our neighbor, a teacher, and a writer. And Randall passed away at his home here in Hillsborough at the end of last month. So with me today are Lee Smith, whose most recent book is Blue Marlin, and Lee is joining us from Castine, Maine today. Hi, Lee. Jackie Shelton Green's debut album, The River Speaks of Thirst.
Hello.
Jackie Shelton Green's debut album, The River Speaks of Thirst, launched earlier this year. She is our state's poet laureate and joins from Mebane. Jill McCorkle's latest novel, Hieroglyphics, was just published. She is zooming from downtown Hillsborough, as is Tom Rankin, her husband, whom I believe is in the same house. Tom is a photographer, filmmaker, and folklorist. And last but not least, Daniel Wallace, who is the Director of Creative Writing at UNC and a fine author in his own right. And they were all friends of Randall. For those of you who are not that familiar with Randall, a Twitter biography of him would tell us this. Born in Brooklyn, moved to Duplin County as a baby. Notable works include Let the Dead Bury Their Dead, A Visitation of Spirits, The Fire This Time, and his latest collection, If I Had Two Wings. A recipient of a Guggenheim, a Whiting Award, and the John Dos Passos Prize. Nominated today for the National Book Award in Fiction. Black, gay, Southern, died too young at age 57. Beloved. Elaine Mason, a longtime friend and editor of Randall's, added some sound to my bite of a bio. He had a virtuosic panoply of chuckles, like the notes of an organ, from chuckles of delight and whimsy high in the chest, to those a bit deeper of wonder at the absurdity, to a perilously deep, dark chuckle of endurance. One has to chuckle because one can't kill the damn fool chuckle. So Jill, let me start with you, and before you read a passage from one of his stories in the new collection, talk to us a little bit about Randall's chuckle.
Oh my, well, Randall's chuckle and Randall's facial expressions were never singular, but a complicated mix of all that was going on in his orbit. I think he didn't miss a beat, and the chuckle was often good humor. I think he never missed irony. He took it all in and spun it around and put it back out there in brilliant, provocative ways every time, both in his speech and on the page.
Thanks. What are you going to read for us?
I'm going to read a little bit of the story Mommy Wada that comes from an African folk tale. It's the one story in the new collection that is not contemporary. You have runaway slaves living in the swamp, not knowing what's coming. His version of this old folk tale, and I thought I would just read the opening paragraph to introduce you to Amanda and then come to the closing. Because I think that Randall very often wrote a lot about being suspended between two different worlds, you know, and seeing the offer of both freedom and the threats that come with that offer. The lure both of what is unknown and the lure back to what is known and comforting in some way. You know, he so often presents the threats, whether it's a snake or just total unknown darkness, but then brings us back to the bodies of loved ones and food. So I'll just break it down and briefly read. She took her time, walking like a fawn, careful not to make a twig snap. It was getting dark, but she could still see plenty. The voice grew and rose and was the color of mint, like what Aunt Inez grew in a pot. Cool, spearmint, she called it. She caught a glimpse of him standing out in the middle of the creek, and he was quite a sight, darker than she, with a wild head of hair, big berry dark lips, and his eyes seemed to flash in the dimming light. He was not exactly singing, more like humming, but in tune and to rhythm, a rhythm foreign to her ears, yet familiar. The water came up to his belly button, and he seemed to be doing nothing but standing there in the water, humming and bathing, his dark skin glistening with water, and he spooned handfuls upon himself, humming his ditty. And they have their various exchanges, but as the story progresses, the danger is coming, and she's wandered back to the water. So Pharaoh always said they were bound to be found out, to always be ready to pick up and run deeper into the swamp. The dogs were getting closer, and she could hear the voices of the catchers hollering. She figured she couldn't run back to camp in time. Besides, come to me, child. Get in the water. Mandy could hear the dogs louder, closer, crashing through the brush. She peered into the woods to see what she could see. Mandy, you must come now. Time is a-wasting. Mandy was not thinking as she dipped her bare foot into the water and stepped in. Not too cool, not cool at all. Warm like rabbit fur, warm like a belly full of hot chicken, warm like a freshly picked ear of corn, warm like a ripe tomato, warm like Aunt Inez's hands.
I can hear Randall's voice coming through you. Thank you. And, you know, I wanted to ask you, there've been some really wonderful photographs of you and Randall on Facebook. And there's such a natural closeness between the two of you and a relaxed nature that I've seen. And, you know, there's always the private and the public person. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit. What was Randall like as a friend to you, the sort of the private Randall?
Well, I was really fortunate to get to teach with Randall at Swanee a few times. And I think there is a closeness when you team teach and you see someone from a lot of different angles. He was such an extraordinary teacher and hell-bent on everything being genteel in the classroom and kind, but never shying away from what needed to be said. And again, you know, I keep coming back to that word balance when I think of Randall, and I think he just kept himself just perched right in the center. And we share southeastern North Carolina, and even though a lot of that land is below sea level, the roots run mighty deep and connect. And I think, you know, I first met him when he was an undergrad because we shared Max Steele as a primary teacher. And I remember coming back to visit, you know, not long after I had left. I'm sure visiting Lee as well, and being introduced to the students, that current crop of graduating students everyone was talking about, and Randall was certainly front and center in that group. So I've known him for a very long time, and as I say, much in common. I once told him that I had heard the story that my grandfather, who died long before I was born, who had only gone through third grade, whenever he was putting on airs, as my grandmother said, instead of saying glass, he called it a glice. He thought that sounded upper crust, and he would say, "Could I have a glice of iced tea?" And I had told Randall that story years ago, and he never stopped saying that. He got a big kick out of that. I think both the humor and what is poignant in that story, and he didn't miss that sort of thing ever.
We'll have to drink a glass of iced tea to him. Oh, there you go. You've already started, Jill. Thank you. Lee Smith, let me turn to you. And, I had asked you on email how you knew Randall, and I loved what you told me. You said you've known him so long, you can't remember not.
I can't remember. Pretty much ever since we came ever since I came to Chapel Hill, because I was connected with the university, and so was he, and he would be gone and he'd be back and he'd be in and around, but forever.
Well, I sort of love that picture that he's been embedded in your life.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about this book, If I Had Two Wings.
Well, I am just floored, I think, by this book. I mean, and to me, it's just heartbreaking to read, because it's a young man's book. I mean, it is completely, he was 56, right? But it is filled with vigor and originality and imagination and things you've never seen before, heard before, magic realism, and absolute up-to-the-minute social commentary, like that Resurrection Hardware, the play on Restoration Hardware, and the kinds of foodie people we've got in the South now, and all this and that. It's full of humor, it's full of belief, it's full of pathos, and I cannot say enough. Who knows what more he might have written. I mean, I think this is the work of our friend, but it's the work of a great writer, and we are so privileged to be honored to have known him as well, and a huge personality, a huge lot of love that not everybody has for other people and for life. Appetite. He's full of appetite. So
I always found that to be true about him, this generosity of kindness.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe you're going to read something to us too from him.
Yes, I'm going to read just a little bit from this book, Mothers and Strangers, which is a book that I co-edited about Southern writers writing about their mothers. And Randall, as he always said, was lucky enough to have three ladies in his family who had taken him on when he was delivered to them by a younger woman in his family who was just not ready to be having that baby. So the first one is Clem. Clem was descended from a very large family. Family lore has it that I spent my first night in her ancestral home in Chinquapin, North Carolina, located on a bend of the Northeast Cape Fear River. The family originated from and lived in what local people referred to as the quarters. For upon the land where her home sat was where the enslaved people of the long-gone Chinquapin plantation had lived. Miss Viola had many children, so Clem had a vast arena of brothers and nephews and nieces and cousins galore. This was exactly the web of family into which I was born. By the time of my birth, she had grown small-town famous as an outstanding cook. Women who themselves were not slackers in the kitchen held her food in high esteem, and she was a cook for huge gatherings at Camp Lejeune and all kinds of, not only for the family. And he says, my connection to her and her food was a powerful thing. So it was Clem, and then there was Mama, the one he called Mama, who was his great aunt, who took care of him directly. She had been a professional cook, a domestic, a graduate of North Carolina College, later North Carolina Central University, and by and by a kindergarten teacher. That she taught me to read at the age of 4 is not a curiosity. I think it is. But sitting with her, looking at Beatrix Potter's bright watercolors, imagining Peter Rabbit and that sinister farmer McGregor, why don't he leave that rabbit alone, introduced me to the keys of the world. I remember not only that book, ultimately written all over by this engaged child who did not imagine the story could ever end, but also the pads with the blue lines, 3 in which to capture the print, the R's and T's and serpentine S's, a lifelong fascination with the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, but more. For some particular reason, on the Christmas of my 5th year, Mama gave me a children's adaptation of Moby Dick, full of the lurid illustrations of the great whale and the doomed captain, and dramatic seas and thunderous skies. My mind was overstimulated, and happily so. In short, I was hooked. Soon would come Treasure Island, Kidnap, the Swiss Family Robinson. To this day, I'm slightly ashamed of my obsession with these blonde kids marooned on a tropical island. Like Nellie Mae, my heart was just too damn large. And then let me switch back for a minute to Nellie Mae, a substantial woman of substantial proportions in the spirit of a mighty thing. Her hugs were crushing, enveloping, as genuine as heavy rain. Her laugh, her smile, her cooking, her generosity with time and things exuded a largeness of spirit, a positivity, a joy. Nellie Mae had a vast green Pontiac Bonneville, circa 1970, when cars had more in common with whales than the combustion engine. On Saturdays, Mama, Clem, Nellie Mae, and I would take trips down to Wilmington, about a 2-hour drive. And then they would all go to the department store by Hudson Bell, and he would have to color in his coloring book while they all tried on dresses, and he was down on the floor coloring in his coloring book. And there was one humid day when he became frustrated with the heat and declared loudly, "I'm having a hot flash," which was something he had heard his trio of ladies say before, and they roared with laughter, much to my confusion. It would be another decade before I understood their amusement. So here are the 3, and he closes their little discussion with this paragraph. And so, as always, there are 3 things: a love of food, an instinct toward compassion, a love of words and story. To me, these all work together, bind each other, make wonderful sense, make life life. How could a fellow not wax in gratitude, recognizing the seeds of his life? The 3 things these women gave me: love of food, love for my fellow human, love of reading.
Thank you, Lee. It's beautiful. Jackie Shelton Green, you met Randall in the 1980s, and you emailed me this week that you would circle around each other in different social and academic groups, and I can kind of see the 2 of you. And you wrote, "I think our first lengthy conversation was after a book reading party for Let the Dead Bury the Dead, from which you became really fast friends." So what was the raison d'etre of your friendship? What was the core of that friendship?
The core for Randall and I was ourself. Our many conversations about the Black Southern night, the Black of a South in the night that was very different than a white Blackness of the night. Randall and I did not have so much a verbal language of communication. We'd be in settings and something would be said from the podium and he'd turn around and he glanced back at me, and I knew exactly what that glance meant in context to what was being said. One time Randall asked me, and I went on to find that he'd actually written these words, but he asked me one time, does the land imagine? Does the land dream? He asked me, what does your land dream about? And these were the expressions that, we kind of had this coded relationship sometimes when conversations were very brief. Sometimes our conversations would be very, very long, simply about the content of a pie, the best crust.
Back to food. Back to food.
Crisco or Wesson. But those were the conversations because they were based on both of us expressing our appreciation of the truths that the ghosts that were amongst us and our Black South, how they continued to force us to open our tongues to speak. Wow, the hushed Black story is what we talked about. That Black nuance of secret and taboo and forbidden pleasures that as Black children of the South, that we could talk about that. And it was not about literary genius. It was not about what it meant to his canon of publication, but what it meant as two Black children sharing a story. And that tenderness that Randall extended to me, I appreciate deeply. And the food book, I call it the food book because all my friends call it the food book. That food book you and Randall, that Randall wrote that you're in. I remember when he called me after I submitted my piece, and he just kept saying, Miss Jackie, Miss Jackie, Miss Jackie. And I knew what that meant. So that was our relationship. It was very nuanced, and it was very truthful. And I felt like Randall held me accountable as a poet, wanting to make sure that the narratives that I wanted to represent were full of truth and not fear. And that's really what transpired, continues to transpire through me, because this morning, Randall told me that I was not reading Coda, and that's what I'd selected, but he actually directed me to something else to read.
Well, we will come back to that in a little bit, okay? And the food book that you're referring to, I believe that some guys help me. I think it's the Carolina Table or the Carolina Farm Table.
Carolina Table.
Carolina Table, published by Eno Publishers here in Hillsborough. Thanks, Jackie. Tom Rankin, first of all, I want to thank you for helping me organize today. And I also gave you a little bit of a short shrift in the introduction. So I want to note here that you were the longtime director of Duke's Center for Documentary Studies. And as I understand history, you are responsible for bringing Randall to Duke and to UNC in the early 2000s. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that came to be and why.
Well, Randall and I met first in Oxford when he was the Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi. My last year in Oxford before I came to Duke, we actually met in a bar, which was uncharacteristic of either of us, but we were. And we talked about Mississippi, we talked about teaching at the University of Mississippi, and we talked about North Carolina and eventually about UNC. And I've said this to Jill, that, even in that moment, the gravitas that Randall had standing there in his quiet, kind of almost retiring way was so impressive. It was clear to me that this is somebody you don't run into very often, both intellectually, the kindness, the ability to see. People say that Randall knew more than everybody, and I've always felt like he actually understood more than everybody. I mean, he knew a lot of things, but he understood them, which is a whole nother dimension. So I was really taken and was sorry that I was leaving because that was the year he was there. And so when I got to the center, one of the areas of the center that we didn't really have developed much at all was documentary writing. We were so visual, and I started thinking about inviting somebody. And Randall's book, Walking on Water, had just come out. 6 years of recordings around the country about Black life at the end of the 20th century, and just an audacious kind of exercise to write a book about. And I was very much, so I called him and said, would you be interested in coming? And he said, he would admit this now, he would say, I really want out of Memphis. He was teaching at the University of Memphis. And there's nothing I want more than to come back to North Carolina. And so within minutes, he was the next Lehman Brady joint chair professor. I had to get his CV to send to the deans, which I sort of resented, because why do you need Randall's CV to hire him? But, and he came and taught documentary writing. And, you know, Randall's always been interested in that line between fiction and nonfiction, between the truth of the fact and the truth of the imagination. And he really kind of laid the foundation for how documentary writing, you know, we later had Paul Hendrickson and Jackie teaches at the center now, teaching documentary poetry. But Randall was just a gift, and that position teaches at UNC too. And he ended up being hired the next year to stay at UNC. And so he used to like to give me credit for bringing him back to North Carolina. And I found in a book he signed to me. Nobody's ever called me the dude, but Randall. He said that the dude who single-handedly brought me back to North Carolina, which is not really true, but I'll take the dude.
It's very sweet.
Very sweet. And sweet he was, but as Jill and Jackie have intimated, you know, behind the sweetness was an all-knowing, understanding mind that, and I always appreciated that. He ended up being on the board of the Center for Documentary Studies, probably the longest serving board member. He was on the board when he died. Something I'm not sure was where he should have put his time, but he was so loyal and so helpful and so committed. And that's the other side of Randall is, you know, the loyalty that Randall showed people and the way he really invested in other people is immeasurable. I mean, his books will live on, but so will all these people, some of whom don't even know why they think what they think. They were in his classes, or they were in his workshop, or us sitting here talking, for that matter.
And it was really amazing on Twitter after he passed what kind of outpouring of emotion there was from so many people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
And that will continue, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel. So Tom mentioned that Randall taught at UNC, and you teach at UNC. I know you have many intersections in your life with Randall, and it is commonly said that, you know, you were the closest of friends. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of that friendship with us now.
Yeah, you know, we started teaching at UNC at about the same time. He was actually hired, and I was a lecturer who popped in and out of classes. And but you know, he was on full time, and in the beginning, I was a little bit intimidated by him, as he was the kindest person, the sweetest person, but he was also just his presence was unlike anybody I've ever known. Just the beingness of him in the stairwell at Greenlaw. He was a presence in the classroom. He was a presence when he subbed for me. I would actually hate that, because when I came back and I tried to teach my class, the students would say, "Well, Professor Kenan said," and it's always difficult to come back into a classroom after Randall was in it. He gave himself, as Tom was saying, he gave his all to everything that he did, everything that he committed to. And you can see that in the essay that Lee read. He said yes to everything. And to the point where, and I know Lee probably knows this really well with this book. He was always 15 minutes late everywhere he went. He told me, if you're always late, then you're really always on time. You can't just be late a couple of times. You have to be late all the time. And it got to a point, I asked him to forward all of the emails he got requesting some burden, some assignment, so I could say no for him, or I could write the no, because he would not say no. He would never, ever say no. He was on committee after committee at UNC. I don't honestly know how he did what he did in the relatively short time he was here, the very short time he was here. He was a polymath. He knew our culture and all culture from the bottom up. There was nothing too sublime or too ridiculous for him to appreciate it for what it was. He loved science fiction and started writing science fiction early on until Max Steel kind of took him in another direction. So that was one of the reasons, I think, why we did slowly actually become good friends. It was just this shared interest in things. And as we approached each other and felt each other out, we just discovered that we liked the same books, we liked the same music. And that's, I think, is one of the things that makes up a friendship. But I also love how people, everybody here is describing the same person, different aspects of the same person. He was consistent in everything he did.
Yeah, I have this memory of being at your house, and a couple of years ago, Laura was making a really lovely dinner, and Laura, your wife, and you and Randall were on the sofa. I have this image of Jill and Randall just sort of being warm with each other, and you and Randall are like giggling and laughing away. I don't know about what, but it's embedded there. I'm going to read you something that came up in my little investigation today. I went to Rate My Professor and looked up Randall. And under the headline, Awesome, came, Dr. Kenan is one of the nicest people you will meet. He cares about the class and will ensure that you learn something if you care. He tells hilarious anecdotes, and his mentorship through this class makes me want to minor in creative writing. Take him. I know, I saw you wince. I think they were just lovely, and sounds like you really enjoyed teaching.
Probably the only professor who's not scared to go look at Rate Your Professor.
Just about to say that.
And, I did not look anybody else up, so you're
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to just read a short statement that Sharon Wheeler, who is the owner of Purple Crow Books, sent in. And she wrote, about 2 weeks before his death, Randall and I discussed the possibility of folks at a virtual book festival purchasing books from Purple Crow, where he could sign or personalize them, and then we would ship them. We were happy to do this, as we are for all local authors. What struck me about this exchange is how happy Randall seemed. Always joyful, he seemed especially satisfied with this latest book. I find comfort in thinking he died that way. And he was a very big supporter of our bookstore and of all of our institutions. And for those of you listening to this, Randall's books can be bought at Purple Crow, as can all of my friends here. So, Jackie, I'm going to come to you now. And so you're not reading from Coda. You're reading from something else because Randall told you that. And please do.
Because Randall told me. So actually, Randall guided me this morning to go back to this book.
Oh, yeah.
It's
What's the title?
Understanding Randall Kenan. And he directed me to A Time Not Here, which was about a collection of photographs that the photographer Norman Moskoff was creating, and Randall responded to that collection. So these are his words. Land of sorrow, land of sweat, land of memory, land of midnight trains, land of the screech owl and the bear and the katydid and the coon and the timber rattler and the panther, land of tractors, land of foreclosures, land of once slave and now freedom, land of money, land of hogs and cows and chickens and turkeys and farm cats and dogs, land of corn and soybean, land of cotton, land of fear, land of hate, land of painful memories, land of God, land of Satan, land of pine and sycamore and spruce and maple and magnolia, land of love, land of heartbreak, land of misery, land of hope, land of grace. Yes, grace. So when I found myself reading this, I felt like Randall was saying that that's what he's left with us, is grace. The power of grace, the spirit, the invitation to step inside of the space that he's created for all of us, a space of grace. And I think that was the message that I felt guided to by him. And I really mean guided. I feel like that those ghosts that we talked about, they're not really ghosts. You know, Randall reminded me over and over that none of us escape the whipping post that has our names carved on it.
Mhm.
So I think these words were words that, for me, sum up just the epitome of what he's accomplished about writing about the land that he loved and knew so well.
Yeah.
Grace. Thank you, Jackie. So let me ask you this. In this remembrance that Elaine Mason wrote for LitHub about knowing Randall and editing Randall, she, and people have referred to how involved he was, how busy he was in so many activities. She wrote, when I tried to get him to turn down some of the other requests, the literary service work to free up space for his novel, he basically said to me, it's too risky. As a Black man, I can never feel that my livelihood is secure. What do you think Randall meant by that?
Well, I know what he exactly meant, that for us, we cannot afford to leave the landscape for one moment. The fact that he is a published man of color, the fact that he has the notoriety and the history that he has of publishing, Randall did not take that for granted. We talked about it a lot. We talked about how easy it is for our white friends, our white colleagues, our peers to write about us and be celebrated and get published. That is far easier sometimes than to get our own work published. And for myself, I akin that, we've talked about this a lot. When I was very ill, it was very, very difficult to re-enter or find my place again after being off of the landscape. You know, we're forgotten pretty quickly. the gatekeepers had changed, the codes had changed, the rules had changed. So this idea of how do we recreate ourselves? How do we continually have to be thinking about packaging ourselves so we will be consumable again? And I understand that responsibility, and just that foreshadowing responsibility sometimes bears heavy weight on being creative. You know, when we're worrying about, oh, I've written all this work, but how often am I going to be able to share it to experience public audiences for the work? So that was a conversation that we shared many years ago about what it meant to be a writer of color trying to cross boundaries in the publishing arena.
Mm-hmm. So tangential to that, you know, he was a man of color, he was Black, he was gay, he was Southern. Do we need to put an adjective next to writer when we talk about him?
You know, when I think about that question, I thought about an interview I read once where journalists asked James Baldwin, when you were starting out as a writer, you were Black, impoverished, and homosexual. You must have said to yourself, gee, how disadvantaged can I get? And Baldwin's response was, no, I hit the jackpot. It was so outrageous you had to figure out all the ways to use it. So Randall was an advocate. You know, he didn't allow us to box him, to frame him in the caption of gay, Southern gay. The fact that, you know, it was disappointing that he wasn't in the beginning writing about the Black experience as white Southern writers would want him to write. You know, we too read the classics and have appreciated other things. And that's what I appreciate about Randall's legacy. That's what he's leaving, I think, to a lot of emerging young writers, and especially perhaps young gay male writers, is that you can be who you need to be and create your own captions. And I think that's the most important way that I could respond to that question. Is Randall certainly did not shirk away from many of those captions. He was emphatic in all of his beings. But what's most important is Randall did not allow us to strip him from his wholeness. And that's the important thing, is any of us who are writers going forth is to maintain our sense of self. I love Randall doing that with his characters that were often, you know, you fall in love with a character and Randall's like gone on to the next character. He just like leaves you there, just dropping through the air, and you have to figure it out. And that's the essence of genius,
Mm-hmm.
of literary genius. And that to me perhaps is more important than all of the boxes that have been stamped upon him.
Thank you. Tom, I think you're going to read something to us now.
You're muted.
I was going to read the last paragraph from the first story in the new collection, When We All Get to Heaven, and it's a nice segue from what Jackie was just saying. The way that Randall is often characters are occupying very multiple places at once. And this is it doesn't need a lot of setup, but it's Ed Phelps is in New York. Ed is almost 60. His wife is a delegate to the National Baptist Convention, which is why they're there, Iselene. And Ed's been a plumber. He's still working, and he's taking a walk around town while she's at the convention. And in his walk, he's had this amazing experience with Billy Idol, of all things. So there's Randall. You know, who would have thunk it? Anyway, he at the end of the day, he's back in the hotel room, kind of reviewing the day, and I'll just begin with Randall here. The day weighed down upon him, but the day was feather soft. The day was sweating bottles of water. The day was loud like cigars and smell of truck horns. The day was a golden giant flying among the skyscrapers, delivering fire to a beautiful Latina. Oya mama sa. Hot day, long day, sweet day, music day. And the day turned to a guitar, and the guitar strings turned to worms, and the worms turned into cucumbers, and the cucumbers turned into his mother's fingers, and she gave them to him, peeled white with salt and pepper and a little vinegar. And the taste was high childhood, and the taste was still new. And the sun was high in the sky, and it was 1946, and he was 14, and he was in the tobacco field, and deep in the lugs, and the day was hot, but he was happy. Bacco, bacco, ain't no bacco in heaven I know. And he heard his grandfather's voice, and his grandfather was singing, and he heard his grandfather's voice, and his grandfather was singing. Maybe not only Randall, but certainly Randall, over and over again, he just occupied in that one paragraph so many worlds, so many sentiments, so many times, contemporaries going back, all sort of effortlessly. But back to what Jackie was saying about, Randall didn't want to occupy just one place. He didn't want to be just one thing, but he also didn't want to occupy just one place. And his characters don't. They're fluid. I think Jill said they're, earlier, suspended between two different worlds. There's often that going on. It's beautiful.
It is beautiful. And Jill, let me ask you this. For someone who has not read Randall Kenan previously, where should they begin?
I think it's always good to start at the beginning. but I do think that this, amazing collection, if you have not read the earlier work, will send you back, because he has his characters who are ever present, and you're following the genealogy of these people, this tribe of people, Tim's Creek. It's a very specific world that is also universal. And so I think that the new collection is pretty amazing in that way, and that it really is a strong, fair representation of everything Randall, both as a person and his work.
I certainly found it very accessible, funny in places, moving. So many different textures.
Mm-hmm.
Lee, I'm going to come back to you, and Lee and Jill, the same question, but Lee, maybe you can take it first. When you think about Randall, what is his legacy to us as writers, to our community, to this world he inhabited?
Well, because I love his work so much, I think that his great legacy is his work. And to me, in what you were reading, to me, it's really Faulknerian, in a certain way. The way it is huge, and the way it will endure. And it's just, I don't know. So to me, I think the work that he has left us is a great, great legacy. But I also think that Randall was a very unusual person, because most artists and writers are not civic. They're not on boards like Tom was saying, he was on a board, or he was the head, when he died, he was the head of the Fellowship of Southern Writers. It's something Jill was, and it just takes the most amount of your time and your energy and so on, energy that you're not putting into your work when you're doing that, but yet somebody's got to do these things. Somebody has got to speak up for artists and writers, and for the arts and their importance in community, in all of our communities, and so on. And Randall was so willing to do that. I think in Elaine Mason's piece that she put in LitHub, I think there was almost a suggestion that maybe his work suffered, perhaps, just because he couldn't write it as much as he might have otherwise, had he not have taken on these things that other people really wanted him to take on. Well, it's hard not to when James Baldwin's family want ask you to do it, right? To write about him and do the book. I mean, geez. But, and you can't, I guess, with that. But I mean, it's again and again, Randall was a wonderful person and he had loyalties. And I think he acted upon his loyalties, and he acted upon to do things for the common good and for community, you know, and he loved, I think, particularly the community of writers in writing and North Carolina and the people he had known. I mean, he was too good, I think, in a way. He was too good. He was maybe too civic for his own to write as much as he might have done, but yet we are all so lucky that he was there to give us this illustration of how it was possible to be a great artist and live in community, you know?
Yeah.
So.
And Jill, what would you like to add to that? And I also know that Randall was going to be involved with a fundraiser that I believe you're spearheading. I'm not sure of the exact name, but it's writers who are supporting.
No, well, no, he and I often talked about, you know, here in and around North Carolina, what we might kick into play. I mean, he along with Jackie was supposed to speak next week at something for Roy Cooper. And so in our conversation, you know, about that upcoming event, we just talked a lot about where we'd like to see money go that maybe gets misspent along the way. So he certainly was very interested in the legal defense funds and
the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
Yes, and adding to what Lee was saying, I mean, his political interest were strong. And I think at this time when we're seeing so much division and walls, I guess I would see Randall's legacy as someone who wanted to be a bridge more than anything. And again, a bridge between these two very different times, these two very different places, to be someone who can both denounce the racism of the past and yet also want to be part of the solution moving forward, not denouncing a place because of the hell that it was. I mean, you know, he stayed, I think, and it must have taken an enormous amount of energy to stay balanced between those two places, because he wrote a lot about God and he wrote about Satan. And I think he stood in a position with the vision of the best of what a man might experience of this world, and the very hardest. And it was such a clear vision. And I have to say that I always paid attention to Randall's little verses at the end of his emails, because I always felt he was sending little messages to the world. And the two that I have loved the most, well, the one that was still on his current emails was the ancient Coptic proverb, life is life and fun is fun, but it's oh so quiet when the goldfish die. And, you know, I decided to research, and it's a line that was used in this one woman play. Anyway, there's always a lot of thought that goes behind anything that he put out to the world. But I think that my favorite one that just, I think is so Randall is, for a long time it came from The Little Prince, and the quote he had was, and he too said nothing because he too was weeping. And I think Randall was never far from the sadness of harder times, people living it. And yet he did all this work for other people, and you know, carrying that torch. I mean, Daniel would know better than anyone there at UNC, and his devoted students and colleagues.
You know, Jill, I wrote down that same ancient Coptic proverb, life is life and fun is fun. I always paid attention to them too. Thank you. Elizabeth Woodman, who's the publisher of Eno Publishers, sent in this statement, and she worked closely with Randall. Randall Kenan was a giant of a literary citizen. His fame and success never dampened his enthusiasm, his accessibility for all things local. He attended book readings of friends and former students religiously. He never said no to a group or class or organization or project that needed a speaker, judge, panelist, brainstormer, teacher, mentor, fundraiser, or in the case of Eno Publishers, a director. He didn't just show up, he engaged on a meaningful level. He reached out frequently with ideas for book subjects, people who might be helpful, events he thought we should know about. His generosity and talent energized everyone around him. Randall was a huge presence in our community. And that's Elizabeth Woodman. So Daniel, I'm going to come to you as we come to the end. So I was struck by one of the last essays that Randall wrote was in Lit Hub, and it was about Confederate statues. And one of the readers proposed that all the Confederate statues in the South be replaced with statues of Randall, and that Kenan Stadium in Chapel Hill, which was named after a white supremacist Kenan, be renamed Randall Kenan Stadium. I love those ideas. How else can we remember him, commemorate him? I know you have some things percolating over there.
It would be so simple to rename the stadium. It's just
Sorry.
I think that we could perform a duty by just all of us going over there and placing Randall right in front of the Kenan that's there. I'm thinking of doing that. So anybody who wants to join me, Tom, you might have a ladder.
I'm in. I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm in.
I'm in.
So as everybody's touched on to some degree, Jackie with the looks that he would give her that was a language in and of itself. And Jill has just written a book about that in hieroglyphics. Every friendship, every relationship has its own language. And there is a public Randall that we all knew, and there's a private Randall, and we all knew some parts of him. And then our language, part of our language was music. And whenever there was a narrative, a significant narrative going on in our own lives, sometimes we didn't really talk about it, but we would send each other music videos that was the soundtrack to our lives at that moment. The last 3 emails I received from Randall, the first was Adele, the second was Gloria Estefan, and the third was Aretha. And they came, one after the other at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 3 o'clock at night. But there were also songs that we traded often over and over again. One of them was It's All Coming Back to Me Now by Celine Dion. And another one was this song from a recent movie called The Greatest Showman with Hugh Jackman. And it's called This Is Me. And it illustrates for me Randall's feeling, his sense of self in the world, in a powerful way that he would not vocalize himself, but would let others do it for him. And I've been listening to it a lot in the last couple of weeks, and I think I would love to share that with everybody now, so they can feel the way we all feel about Randall.